On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, more than 1.5 million German soldiers crossed the Polish border without a declaration of war. At that very moment, in Berlin, a mother woke her children to take them to the air raid shelter in their building's basement. She didn't know she wouldn't sleep peacefully again for 6 years. That mother was named Ilse Meyer, and her story, like that of millions of ordinary Germans, has been buried under the accounts of generals, dictators, and extermination camps. But today we will rescue it. Today we will tell the story of the Second World War from the inside, from the kitchens where there was no bread, from the classrooms where children swore allegiance to the Führer, from the factories where women and prisoners worked until they collapsed, from the air raid shelters where entire families died crushed under tons of rubble. Before we begin, our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers. It seems like a lot, but with your help, we can achieve it. Subscribe now. Click like and be part of this story. Because this story is not just about Hitler. It is about 70 million Germans who lived, suffered, believed, doubted, resisted, or simply tried to survive under the most destructive regime modern humanity has ever known. What was it like waking up each morning in a country devouring itself and the world? What did a father feel seeing his 10-year-old son march in a Hitler Youth uniform? What went through a German soldier's mind upon discovering the truth about the camps? These are the questions we'll answer, and some answers will leave you speechless. But to understand what happened inside Germany during the war, we first need to go back. We need to understand how an entire country, the homeland of Goethe, Beethoven, and Kant, fell into the clutches of an Austrian demagogue who promised greatness and delivered destruction. It all began long before 1939. Germany emerged from World War I destroyed. Not just materially, although the figures are devastating. Almost 2 million German soldiers dead, over 4 million wounded, a collapsed economy, but above all, destroyed in its pride. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, imposed conditions on Germany most Germans considered an unprecedented humiliation. The country lost 13% of its territory, 10% of its population, all its colonies, and was forced to pay war reparations totaling 132,000 million gold marks. To put that in perspective, it was more than the whole country produced in several years. But what hurt most were not the numbers. It was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the conflict. For millions of Germans who had fought and died believing they defended their homeland, this was a stab in the back. A lie. A cosmic injustice. And from that festering wound, the monster would be born. But how does one go from a humiliated nation to a genocidal dictatorship? What happens along the way? The answer is more complex than any textbook can summarize, and it is much more terrifying, because it was not a coup d'etat, not a foreign invasion. Adolf Hitler came to power democratically, and that is perhaps the most chilling part of this whole story. The Weimar Republic, the democratic system that governed Germany between 1919 and 1933, was born weak, born associated with defeat, surrender, Versailles. The moderate parties that sustained it were seen by many as the traitors, who had stabbed the German army in the back. The infamous Dolchstoßlegende, the legend of the stab in the back, a myth propagated by far-right nationalists, who held that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield, but because of the politicians, the socialists, and the Jews. A myth, but a powerful myth, so powerful that millions believed it. And in the midst of this breeding ground of anger, resentment, and desperation, a man appeared. A man with no university studies, who had been a mediocre soldier in World War I, living in cheap Munich boarding houses, and who, however, had an extraordinary talent. He could speak. He could shout. He could channel an entire nation's fury and turn it into political force. Adolf Hitler joined the small German Workers' Party, the DAP, in September 1919, when the party had just a few dozen members. By 1920, he had renamed it National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, the Nazis, and become its most popular speaker. His technique was simple but devastatingly effective, first describing the German people's suffering with almost obsessive detail, then pointing to the culprits, Jews, communists, Weimar politicians, and finally offering a solution, himself. Germany needed a strong leader, a Führer. And did people believe him? At first, many didn't. The Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, the failed coup attempt in Munich, ended with Hitler arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months, in the comfortable Landsberg fortress, where he dictated Mein Kampf to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess. That book, rambling, repetitive, plagued with hatred and delusions of grandeur, would become the Third Reich's foundational text. But in 1924, it seemed the manifesto of an irrelevant madman. What changed? The economy. The hyperinflation of 1923 had already destroyed the German middle class. A US dollar, worth around 48 marks in 1919, rose to 4.2 trillion marks in November 1923. Trillion. People needed wheelbarrows full of bills to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings evaporated in weeks. There was a brief recovery between 1924 and 1929, the so-called golden years of Weimar, in which it seemed that democracy could work. But then came the Wall Street crash of October 1929, and with it, the global economic collapse. Germany was one of the most affected countries. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly a third of the labour force. The hunger queues stretched on for blocks. Families were sleeping in the streets, and the moderate parties had no answers, or at least not any answers that the people wanted to hear. Hitler did, or so it seemed. In the July 1932 elections, the NSDAP won 37.3% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. Not an absolute majority, but enough. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, pressured by conservatives who thought they could control Hitler and use him as a puppet, named him Chancellor of Germany. It was the most catastrophic error of the 20th century, because Hitler had no intention of being anyone's puppet, and he proved it with a speed that astonished even his allies. On February 27th, 1933, just 4 weeks after Hitler was appointed Chancellor, the Reichstag building went up in flames. The circumstances of the fire are still debated by historians. Was it set by the Nazis as a pretext? Was it really the work of the young Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe, who was arrested at the scene? What is not debated is what came next. Hitler used the fire to declare a national emergency. The next day, February 28th, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended fundamental civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the right of assembly, postal and telephone privacy, and protection against searches and confiscations without a judicial order. In a single stroke, Germany ceased to be a democracy. But Hitler wanted more. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, which granted the Chancellor the power to enact laws without Parliament's approval for 4 years. The Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists had already been arrested or had fled. The other parties yielded, some out of fear, others out of calculation, others out of conviction. And with that law, Adolf Hitler became, de facto, the dictator of Germany. All this happened in less than 2 months. Now, how did ordinary people experience this transformation? What was happening in the streets, in the homes, in the hearts of Germans as their country became a dictatorship? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the truth is that many Germans welcome these changes with enthusiasm. Not all, of course. The socialists, the communists, the trade unionists, the critical intellectuals, the independent journalists. They knew from day one what was happening, and many paid the price. The first concentration camps, like Dachau, opened on March 22nd, 1933, were not created for Jews, but for political prisoners, for opponents, for anyone who dared to dissent. But for a significant part of the population, Hitler's rise to power was a cause for hope. After years of chaos, unemployment, hunger, and humiliation, here was a leader who promised order, work, and dignity, and during the first years, he seemed to deliver. Unemployment dropped drastically. Highways were built, the famous Autobahnen, that gave work to hundreds of thousands. The Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, program offered vacations, cruises, and cultural activities to German workers for the first time in history. The Volkswagen, the people's car, was designed so that every German family could own a car. The economy seemed to be reviving. But at what price? Because what many Germans did not see, or did not want to see, is that this prosperity had a dark side. The reduction in unemployment was achieved largely through massive rearmament, which violated the Treaty of Versailles. The jobs of Jews, socialists, and other undesirables were redistributed among Aryan Germans. Women were pushed out of the labour market so that men could take their places, and incidentally, so they could dedicate themselves to their natural function, having children for the Reich. And the independent trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front, an organisation controlled by the party. Nazi prosperity was an illusion built on debt, militarism, and exclusion. But the illusion worked, and propaganda made sure it kept working. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, was a genius of manipulation. Under his direction, every aspect of German cultural life was transformed into an instrument of the regime. The radio, which Goebbels called the Eighth Great Power, became the main means of indoctrination. The government produced the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, a cheap radio set that was sold to millions of German households. By 1939, 70% of German homes had one, and what they heard was a carefully dosed mix of music, manipulated news, and Hitler's speeches. Cinema was also instrumentalized. Leni Riefenstahl filmed Triumph of the Will in 1935, a documentary about the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg that is still considered one of the masterpieces of cinematographic propaganda. Every image is designed to convey power, order, and devotion. Endless columns of soldiers marching in perfect formation, delirious crowds cheering the Führer, imperial eagles silhouetted against dramatic skies. It wasn't information, it was visual hypnosis. But the most effective propaganda was not on the screen or on the radio, it was in the schools. From 1933, the German educational system was completely reformed to serve Nazi ideology. Textbooks were rewritten. In biology classes, racial science was taught. The pseudo-scientific theory that Aryans were a superior race and that Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, and other groups were Untermenschen, subhuman. In history classes, the Germanic past was glorified, and Germany was presented as an eternal victim of foreign conspiracies. In math classes, yes, even in math, the problems involved calculations about bombers, artillery trajectories, and the cost that the mentally ill and disabled represented to the state. A problem from a 1936 textbook literally said, "A mentally ill person costs the state 4 marks daily to maintain. A worker earns 4 marks daily. How many 1,000 mark loans for marriages could be given with the money spent on maintaining the mentally ill?" The implicit answer was clear. Those lives were not worth living. And the children? How did they respond? Many with enthusiasm. The Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, became one of the most massive organizations in history. By 1936, membership was practically mandatory for all young Germans between 10 and 18. By 1939, it had more than 8 million members. The boys received military instruction, went on excursions, sang patriotic songs, competed in sports, and swore allegiance to the Führer. The girls, in the League of German Maidens, the Bund Deutscher Madel, learned home economics, childcare, and racial awareness. They were taught that their greatest contribution to the Reich was to be mothers of healthy Aryan children. For many young people, especially those from poor or marginalised families, the Hitler Youth was a transformative experience. For the first time, they felt part of something big, something powerful, something that gave them identity and purpose. The camps, the uniforms, the camaraderie, everything was designed to create an absolute sense of belonging. And it worked. It worked so well that many of these young people would go to war, willing to die for a man they had never seen in person. But here we must stop and ask an uncomfortable question. A question that is uncomfortable because it has no easy answer. Did the Germans know what was happening? This is perhaps the most debated question in the entire historiography of the Third Reich. And the answer, like almost everything in history, is complicated. Did they know that Hitler hated the Jews? Yes. That was no secret. Anti-Semitism was the central pillar of Nazi ideology, and Hitler had proclaimed it openly since the 1920s. The speeches, the posters, the newspapers, especially the repugnant Der Stürmer of Julius Streicher, with its grotesque caricatures of Jews, left no room for doubt. Did they know about the racial laws? Of course. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, which deprived Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, were publicly announced and celebrated by the regime. Everyone knew. Did they know about the Night of Broken Glass? The pogrom of November 9th to 10th, 1938, in which Nazi mobs destroyed more than 7,500 Jewish businesses, burned more than 1,400 synagogues, murdered at least 91 people, and arrested 30,000 Jewish men who were sent to concentration camps. All this happened in broad daylight, in the streets of cities and towns throughout Germany. Neighbours saw the broken glass. They smelled the smoke. They heard the screams. Many participated. Many more watched in silence. So did they know about the Holocaust? Did they know about the gas chambers, the extermination camps, the industrialised murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims? Here the answer becomes more nuanced. The extermination camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, were located in occupied Poland, far from the eyes of most Germans. The regime used deliberate euphemisms. The deportation of Jews was called resettlement in the East, and the extermination was called Endlösung, the final solution, a bureaucratic term designed to hide the reality behind anodyne language. Many Germans knew that Jews were being deported. They saw the trains. They saw the empty houses. But did they know exactly where they were going and what awaited them? Some did. The soldiers who participated in the mass shootings on the Eastern Front, the Einsatzgruppen, killed more than 1 million Jews with gunfire alone between 1941 and 1942, knew it perfectly. The railway workers who drove the trains to the camps suspected it. The officials who processed the confiscated goods of the deportees could not ignore the evidence. And letters from soldiers returning from the front often contained allusions, veiled or explicit, to atrocities. But for most of the civilian population, the truth was something that floated in the air, like a rumour no one wanted to confirm. It was easier not to ask. It was safer not to know. The historian Robert Galatly, in his study of the Gestapo, showed that the Nazi secret police was surprisingly small, just about 32,000 agents, to monitor more than 60 million people. How was this possible? Because the Gestapo relied heavily on denunciations from ordinary citizens, neighbours denouncing neighbours, co-workers denouncing co-workers, family members denouncing family members. The motivations were varied: ideological conviction, personal grudges, envy, greed for the denounced person's property. or simply the desire to ingratiate oneself with the regime. The Nazi terror was not exclusively imposed from above. It was a shared, co-created, accepted, and in many cases, actively supported terror from below. This is uncomfortable, but it needs to be said. Now, not everyone collaborated, and it is important, crucial, to also tell the stories of resistance, because there was resistance. It was not massive, it was not enough to overthrow the regime, but it existed, and its protagonists paid a terrible price. One of the best-known cases is that of the White Rose, Die Weiße Rose, a group of students at the University of Munich who between 1942 and 1943 distributed clandestine pamphlets, denouncing the crimes of the Nazi regime and calling for passive resistance. Its leaders were Hans Scholl, 24, and his sister, Sophie Scholl, 21. Along with their friend Christoph Probst and Professor Kurt Huber, they wrote 6 pamphlets that were distributed by mail and left in public places. In the 6th pamphlet they wrote, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." On February 18th, 1943, Hans and Sophie were seen throwing copies of their last pamphlet from an inner balcony of the University of Munich. A janitor, a man named Jakob Schmid, saw them and reported them to the Gestapo. They were arrested, interrogated, subjected to a sham trial, presided over by the infamous judge Roland Freisler, and executed by guillotine on February 22nd, 1943. 4 days after their arrest, Sophie Scholl was 21 years old. Her last words, according to testimonies, were, "What a beautiful sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" That sentence still resonates today. But how many people really woke up? How many acted? There were others. The July 20th, 1944 plot. A group of military officers led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg tried to assassinate Hitler by placing a bomb in his Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The solid oak table he was leaning behind deflected much of the blast. The conspirators were captured within hours. Stauffenberg and 3 others were shot that same night in the courtyard of the army headquarters in Berlin. In the following weeks, the Gestapo arrested more than 7,000 people and executed nearly 5,000. Hitler ordered some of the conspirators to be hanged with piano wire and filmed as they died slowly to project the images as a warning. Those executions were filmed, and Hitler watched them. This level of cruelty was the context in which any German who wanted to resist had to operate. It was not just death they risked, it was torture, public humiliation, and the persecution of their entire families under the principle of Sippenhaft, collective clan responsibility. And yet there were still those who resisted. Yes, there were pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who opposed the regime out of his Christian faith and participated in the conspiracy against Hitler, and was hanged in the Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9th, 1945, just weeks before the end of the war. There were people like Oskar Schindler, the German businessman who saved more than 1,200 Jews by employing them in his factories. There were diplomats like Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, who leaked information about the imminent deportation of Danish Jews, allowing the majority, more than 7,000, to be evacuated to Sweden in a clandestine operation in October of 1943. There were thousands of anonymous Germans who hid Jewish neighbours in basements and attics, who forged documents, who shared their rations, who risked everything without expecting anything in return. But they were the exception. And that must also be said. The majority, the vast majority, did not resist. Some out of fear, many out of indifference, and not a few out of conviction. This is the point where the history of Nazi Germany becomes more disturbing, because it is not simply about an evil dictator who deceived an innocent nation. It is about an entire society that, to varying degrees, participated in a system of oppression, persecution, and extermination. But what was daily life like within that system? What was it literally like to live in Nazi Germany during the war? We are going to enter that life. We are going to walk through the war years, one by one, from the inside. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the reaction of the German public was not one of enthusiasm, as it had been in August 1914, at the start of World War I. The memories of that slaughter were too fresh. Most Germans received the news with concern, anxiety, and a resigned sense of inevitability. The reports of the SD Security Service, the SS Intelligence Service, which prepared secret reports on the mood of the population, indicated that there was no widespread war enthusiasm. But there were no protests either. No one took to the streets to call for peace. The propaganda machine immediately went into action, presenting the invasion of Poland as a defensive response to supposed Polish provocations, including the fake Gleiwitz incident, a false flag operation orchestrated by the SS, in which German soldiers disguised as Poles attacked a German radio station on the border to fabricate a pretext for war. The lie was crude, but it was enough. The conquest of Poland was quick, just 5 weeks, and relatively cheap in terms of German casualties, about 16,000 dead. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, worked, and when the victorious troops paraded through Berlin, the population's relief was mixed with cautious pride. Perhaps this war would not be like the last one. Perhaps this time Germany would win quickly and with few losses. That illusion would not last long. But in those first months, the war was barely felt in the daily life of most Germans. Ration cards were introduced on August 27th, 1939, 4 days before the invasion, but the initial rations were reasonably generous. 2,400 daily calories for an adult doing moderate physical work. It was not abundant, but it was sufficient. The variety was limited: black bread, potatoes, margarine, some meat, some cheese. Products like coffee, chocolate, tropical fruits, and tobacco quickly became scarce. A black market emerged where these goods were exchanged at exorbitant prices. The women, whom the regime had insisted on keeping at home, began to be gradually called to the factories to replace the men sent to the front. But Hitler, obsessed with the morale of the Aryan woman, and with the memory of how discontent on the home front had contributed to the 1918 defeat, resisted the total mobilization of female labour for much longer than Great Britain or the Soviet Union. Instead, the regime increasingly resorted to forced labour from prisoners of war and civilians from the occupied territories. By the end of 1939, more than 300,000 Polish prisoners of war were already working in German agriculture and industry. That number would multiply by 10 in the following years. And the German Jews? By September 1939, the Jewish community of Germany, which in 1933 numbered some 500,000 people, less than 1% of the population, had been reduced by less than half. About 250,000 had emigrated, many to countries that would later be conquered by the Nazis, closing the trap. Those who remained lived in increasingly precarious conditions, without the right to work, without access to parks, cinemas, or public swimming pools, forced since September 1941 to wear a yellow Star of David sewn onto their clothing. They lived trapped in a country that had declared them non-human. But they were still alive. That would change. The spring of 1940 brought a series of German military victories that surprised the world and the German people themselves. On April 9th, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in 6 hours, the shortest invasion in the war. Norway resisted more, but by June it was under German control. The strategic objective was to secure the supply of Swedish iron ore through Norwegian ports and establish naval and air bases to harass Great Britain. But what really transformed the German mood was the Battle of France. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched their western offensive. What followed was one of the most spectacular military campaigns in history. Instead of repeating the plan of World War I and attacking through Belgium, which is exactly what the Allies expected, the bulk of the German attack went through the Ardennes, a wooded and mountainous region that the French considered impassable for armoured formations. But the German tanks, under the command of generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, crossed the Ardennes in 3 days and broke the French lines at Sedan on May 13th. What followed was a disaster for the Allies. The British and French forces, cut off and surrounded, were pushed to the coast. More than 300,000 soldiers, mostly British, were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th in what the British celebrate as a miracle, but was in reality a catastrophic defeat. France signed the armistice on June 22, 1940, in the same railway car and in the same place, the clearing of Ratondes, in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918. Hitler deliberately organised the ceremony there as an act of symbolic revenge. The humiliation of Versailles had been, at least in appearance, erased. The reaction in Germany was euphoric. After the initial anxieties of September 1939, the fall of France caused an outburst of patriotic enthusiasm that the regime fueled with parades, celebrations, and incessant propaganda. SD reports recorded an unprecedented wave of optimism. Many Germans who had had doubts about Hitler became believers. If he has achieved this, they said, perhaps he really is the man destined to make Germany great. Hitler was at the peak of his popularity, and the war, for most Germans, seemed to be won. But it was not. Great Britain, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, who had replaced the appeaser Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940, the same day as the German attack in the West, refused to surrender. Churchill delivered his famous speeches. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." And he meant it. Hitler expected the British to negotiate. They did not. And that changed everything. Because while the war with Great Britain continued, Hitler was already looking east, towards the Soviet Union, towards what he considered the real enemy, Judeo-Bolshevism. But what did all this mean for ordinary Germans? How did they experience those months of victory? For many, life improved, at least materially. The plundered goods from the conquered countries flowed into Germany, food from France, Holland, and Denmark, minerals from Norway, manufactured products from all over Western Europe. Soldiers sent packages home with French coffee, Belgian chocolate, Dutch silk stockings. The economist Götz Ali, in his controversial but well-documented book Hitler's Beneficiaries, argued that the regime deliberately bought the loyalty of the German population by redistributing the wealth stolen from the occupied countries and the victims of the Holocaust. Tax cuts for the middle and lower classes, generous subsidies for soldiers' families, and a constant flow of consumer goods, all financed by plunder and exploitation. In other words, many Germans benefited materially from Hitler's criminal empire, and that made it easier not to ask questions. But the war was also beginning to take its toll. The first British bombs fell on Berlin on August 25th, 1940, in response to an accidental German bombing of London. The damage was minimal, but the psychological shock was enormous. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German territory. "If that happens," he had said, "you can call me Meyer," a common Jewish name used as a sarcastic expression of incredulity. The joke turned on him, and the Germans began to call him Meyer behind his back. Those initial bombings were insignificant compared to what would come, but they already planted the seed of fear. And what was happening at the front? What did the German soldiers who were fighting this war feel? The diaries and letters of Wehrmacht soldiers reveal a broad spectrum of attitudes. Many were genuinely convinced of the justice of their cause, especially in the early years of victories. Propaganda had educated them to believe that Germany had been a victim of historical injustices and that the war was necessary to restore its rightful place in the world. Others fought out of a sense of duty, for camaraderie, or simply because they had no choice. Desertion was punished with death. But even among the most enthusiastic, the reality of the war began to erode certainties. A soldier wrote to his wife from France in June 1940, "We have won, but the price. The destroyed towns, the dead civilians. Sometimes I wonder if all this was worth it." That doubt, in 1940, was still rare. In 1943, it would be omnipresent. But something happened in 1940 that is much less talked about. Something that had nothing to do with battles or borders, but with hospitals, psychiatric clinics, and nursing homes. It was called Action T4. Under this codename, the Nazi regime carried out a program of systematic murder of people with physical and mental disabilities. The program was personally authorized by Hitler in a private letter dated, retroactively, September 1st, 1939, the day the war began. In that letter, Hitler authorized specific doctors to grant a mercy death to patients who, according to their judgment, suffered from incurable diseases. Mercy death. The euphemism is chilling. In practice, what happened was this. Patients from psychiatric hospitals and institutions for people with disabilities were evaluated by medical commissions, often without even seeing the patient, based solely on a form, and classified as lives unworthy of being lived. Lebensunwertes Leben. Those selected were transferred to 6 extermination centres: Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hadamar. There they were murdered in gas chambers disguised as showers, the method that would later be used on an industrial scale in the Holocaust extermination camps. The families received a letter informing them that their loved one had died of pneumonia or a heart attack. The ashes they received in an urn were not necessarily those of the deceased. They were mixed at random. And the doctors who administered the lethal injections, who opened the gas valves, who falsified the death certificates, who were they? They were normal doctors. Some were young idealists who sincerely believed in racial hygiene. Others were career civil servants who obeyed orders. Some even considered that they were performing an act of compassion by freeing these patients from their suffering. The human capacity to rationalize horror knows no limits. Between January 1940 and August 1941, the T4 program murdered approximately 70,000 people, 70,000 human lives exterminated by their own government, in their own country, in hospitals. But something extraordinary happened. The T4 program is one of the few cases in which public pressure forced the Nazi regime to retreat, at least officially. Families began to suspect. The death certificates contained obvious errors. A patient who had supposedly died of appendicitis, but whose appendix had been removed years before. Several patients from the same institution dying on the same day of the same illness. The grey buses that took the patients away and never returned them. The children of the town of Hadamar who, according to testimonies, pointed to the buses and said, "There go the crazy people to be gassed." And there were protests. The Bishop of Munster, Clemens August von Galen, delivered a sermon on August 3rd, 1941, in which he publicly denounced the murders. "Do you have the right to kill?" he asked the congregation. "Does the state have the right to kill the innocent, the weak, those who cannot defend themselves?" The sermon was copied and distributed clandestinely throughout Germany. It even reached the soldiers at the front. Hitler, furious, ordered a halt to the T4 program on August 24th, 1941. But the order was only cosmetic. The murders continued in a decentralized manner, through deliberate starvation, medication overdoses, and medical neglect, until the end of the war. It is estimated that the total number of victims rose to between 200,000 and 300,000 people. And why is it so important to talk about T4? Because it was the dress rehearsal for the Holocaust. The methods, the logistics, the personnel, and even the technology, the gas chambers camouflaged as showers, were developed and perfected in T4 before being exported to the extermination camps in occupied Poland. Many of the men who ran the T4 centres were later transferred to Operation Reinhardt, the extermination program that managed Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. The Holocaust did not begin in Auschwitz. It began in German hospitals, with German patients and with German doctors. This fact alone should force us to rethink the idea that the Germans did not know. Of course they knew, at least about T4. Many knew for certain, and some protested, but not enough. But what was happening on the Eastern Front? Because it is there, on the endless plains of the Soviet Union, that the war transformed into something completely different, something that would change Germany forever. On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa, named in honor of Frederick Barbarossa, the medieval emperor who launched a crusade, was conceived by Hitler as a war of annihilation. It was not a conventional war against a rival army. It was a racial war against what the Nazis considered an inferior civilization ruled by Jews. The orders the soldiers received were explicit. The Commissar Decree, issued before the invasion, ordered the immediate execution of captured Soviet political commissars. In direct violation of the laws of war, the Barbarossa Decree exempted German soldiers from responsibility for crimes against Soviet civilians. And behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads, followed the regular army with a specific mission: to murder all Jews, communists, and undesirable elements they found. The first months were of dizzying advance. German forces penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and approached Moscow. Propaganda reports presented the invasion as a triumphal march. Newsreels in cinemas and radios showed tanks advancing, liberated towns, Soviet soldiers surrendering in droves. But the reality at the front was very different from what the propaganda showed at home. The distances were immense. The Russian roads were often simple dirt tracks that turned into impassable quagmires with the rains. The supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the Soviet army, although it suffered catastrophic defeats in the first months, more than 3 million prisoners in 1941 alone, did not collapse. Unlike France, which surrendered in 6 weeks, the Soviet Union had immense territory to retreat into, a huge population to mobilize, and a leadership, brutal, ruthless, but effective, willing to sacrifice millions of lives to buy time. And then the winter came. The Russian winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest of the century. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, who had been sent to the front in summer uniforms because the campaign was expected to end before autumn, froze to death in their trenches. The tank engines would not start. The rifle oil solidified. Fingers stuck to the metal of the weapons. Soldiers wrapped their boots in newspapers, rags, anything they could find. It was not enough. A soldier wrote to his family from the outskirts of Moscow, "I cannot describe what this cold is. It is not like the cold we know. It is something that gets into your bones, that robs you of the will to live. Men who were healthy yesterday wake up with black feet. They are cut off, and they keep fighting." On December 5th, 1941, the Soviet army launched a massive counteroffensive in front of Moscow that pushed the Germans back up to 300 kilometers in some sectors. It was the first major German defeat of the war. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. And at home, how did the Germans receive this news? The propaganda downplayed the Soviet counteroffensive. and presented it as a planned shortening of the front line. But the letters from the front did not lie. German families began to receive the first massive waves of death notifications. By the end of 1941, more than 300,000 German soldiers had died on the Eastern Front in just 6 months of combat, more than in the entire campaigns of Poland, Norway, France, the Balkans, and North Africa combined. And with the death letters also came the letters from the living, letters that spoke of hunger, cold, fear, and increasingly of things that could not be said openly. A soldier stationed in Ukraine wrote to his mother in October 1941, "I can't tell you what I've seen. I can only tell you that I'm not the same man who left. Maybe I never will be again." Another wrote, "Yesterday I saw something that no human being should see. Don't ask me what. Pray for my soul." What had they seen? The mass shootings of Jews. The largest of all occurred at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv, on September 29th and 30th, 1941. In just 48 hours, the Einsatzgruppen, with the help of Ukrainian police and Wehrmacht soldiers, murdered 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children. They were forced to undress, walked to the edge of the ravine, and were shot. Many fell alive among the bodies and died crushed or suffocated. The survivors who tried to escape were hunted down. Those who managed to hide were denounced by neighbours. 33,771 people in 2 days. And Babi Yar was not an isolated case. It was one of hundreds of similar massacres that occurred throughout the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1943. In Rumbula, near Riga, 25,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days, in November 1941. In Ponary, near Vilnius, more than 70,000 people, mostly Jews, were shot over 3 years. In Odessa, more than 30,000 Jews were massacred in October of 1941. The Einsatzgruppen, with a staff of just 3,000 men, divided into 4 units, murdered more than 1.5 million people, the vast majority Jews, between 1941 and 1943. But they did not act alone. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers participated in many of these massacres, guarding the victims, closing perimeters, sometimes shooting themselves. Local collaborationist police from Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and other countries participated actively, and local civilian populations often pointed out where Jews were hiding when they did not attack them directly. This is one of the darkest aspects of the Second World War, and also one of the most silenced for decades, both in Germany and in the countries where these massacres occurred. But how was it possible? How did men who weeks before had been bakers, carpenters, accountants, teachers, become mass murderers? This question has obsessed historians, psychologists, and philosophers since 1945. There is no single answer, but there are factors that help to understand, which is not the same as justify. First, indoctrination. Years of anti-Semitic propaganda, from school to the army, had dehumanized Jews in the eyes of many Germans. When you don't see the other as a human being, killing them becomes easier. Second, group pressure. In combat situations, conformity is a powerful force. Refusing to participate meant being seen as a coward, traitor, or weak by your comrades. Although some refused, and were generally not severely punished for it, contrary to the myth, the majority yielded to social pressure. Third, alcohol. There is abundant documentation that the executioners drank large amounts of alcohol before, during, and after the massacres. Heinrich Himmler himself, leader of the SS, visited a mass shooting in Minsk in August 1941 and was so disturbed that he almost fainted. It was then that they began to look for more efficient and less stressful killing methods for the executioners, which led to the development of gas vans and eventually the gas chambers of the extermination camps. Note the perversion. The problem Himmler wanted to solve was not the suffering of the victims, but that of the executioners. And fourth, Perhaps most disturbingly, some enjoyed it. The research of historian Daniel Goldhagen, though controversial and debated, documented cases of gratuitous sadism that went far beyond obedience to orders, public humiliations, tortures, playful murders. Not all perpetrators were sadists, not by a long shot, but some were, and the system did not punish them, it rewarded them. Now, we must pause here, because we have been talking about the front, about the Einsatzgruppen, about the horrors of the war in the East. But the central question of this video is, what was it like to live inside Germany? What was happening in the cities, in the towns, in the homes? For the German housewife, 1941 was the year the war began to be truly felt. Rations were reduced. Meat became a luxury. Potatoes and black bread became the basis of the diet. Soap was rationed. 1 bar per person per month. Clothes, rationed. Shoes, rationed. Everything was controlled by a coupon system that became increasingly restrictive. But the difference with other countries at war was significant. Thanks to the systematic plundering of the occupied territories, Germany maintained a higher standard of living than, for example, Great Britain for most of the war. Food came from France, Holland, Denmark, Ukraine. Forced labourers produced goods that the Germans consumed. The regime was fully aware that keeping the population's stomach full was essential to maintain their loyalty. They remembered 1918, when hunger had contributed to the revolution. Cultural life continued, though under strict control. The cinemas remained open, showing films approved by Goebbels, like comedies, musicals, historical dramas, and of course the frontline newsreels, the Wochenschau, the weekly newsreels that showed the victories of the front with triumphal music and epic narration. Theatres continued to offer Wagner operas and classical plays. Cafes remained open, although real coffee had been replaced by chicory and barley substitutes that no one pretended tasted good. But beneath this surface of normality, tension was growing. The air raid sirens began to sound more frequently. The blackout drills, the Verdunkelung, forced every window to be covered with opaque curtains, so that enemy bombers could not be guided by the city lights. A neighbour who left a visible crack of light risked a fine, a denunciation, or worse. The Blockwarter, the block wardens of the Nazi Party, one for each building or block of apartments, were in charge of monitoring compliance. They were the eyes and ears of the regime on every corner. They knew who secretly listened to the BBC, who made defeatist comments, who did not hang the swastika flag on the appointed days. And did people listen to the BBC? Yes. Despite it being forbidden under penalty of prison, and in extreme cases, death, millions of Germans tuned in to the BBC's German-language broadcasts and other Allied radio stations. It was the only source of information not controlled by Goebbels. Those who listened knew more than their neighbours, but they also lived with the constant fear of being discovered. A joke circulating in Germany at the time went, "What is an optimist? A German who believes the German news. What is a pessimist? A German who believes the English news. What is a realist? A German who believes neither of them." The jokes, the Flüsterwitze, the whispered jokes, were a form of daily resistance, minimal but real. They were told in a low voice, in circles of trust, and served as an escape valve for frustration and fear. But telling a joke about Hitler could cost you your life. The regime took political humour very seriously. Thousands of people were denounced, arrested, and condemned for undermining the morale of the people. The crime of Wehrkraftzersetzung, for telling jokes, making sarcastic comments, or expressing doubts about victory. If 1940 was the year of victories, and 1941 the year of expansion, 1942 was the year the war began to turn against Germany, and the people felt it. On the Eastern Front, the summer offensive of 1942 advanced towards the Caucasus and the Volga. The Sixth Army of General Friedrich Paulus reached Stalingrad in August and began a battle that would last for months and become the very symbol of the war of attrition. What the Germans did not know, what the propaganda carefully concealed, was that the Red Army was preparing a colossal trap. But before talking about Stalingrad, we must talk about what was happening far from the front. In January 1942, in a villa by Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials met for just 90 minutes to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe. The Wannsee Conference was not a meeting to decide on extermination. That decision had already been made and was underway since at least the summer of 1941. It was a bureaucratic meeting to coordinate logistics, to assign responsibilities, to set priorities, to decide who would be deported first and to which camp. The minutes of the meeting, drafted by Adolf Eichmann and personally corrected by Reinhard Heydrich, are one of the most chilling documents in human history. Not for what it says explicitly, it uses euphemisms like evacuation and special treatment, but for what it implies, the cold, methodical, bureaucratic planning of the murder of 11 million people. 11 million. That was the figure Heydrich presented as the objective. All the Jews of Europe, including those from countries not yet conquered, like Great Britain, Switzerland, and Sweden. What did the participants think as they drank cognac and discussed deportation figures, as if they were industrial production statistics? Did they feel anything? Eichmann himself, decades later at his trial in Jerusalem, declared that he felt relieved after the meeting because he saw that his superiors, secretaries of state, generals, accepted the plan without objection. If these people of the highest rank of the state gave their approval, he said, who was I to have doubts? The banality of evil. Hannah Arendt coined that phrase observing Eichmann at his trial. A grey, mediocre bureaucrat who did not personally hate Jews, or at least no more than the average German of his generation, but who organised their transport to the gas chambers with the efficiency of a logistics manager moving goods. He was not a monster. He was something worse. He was normal. And what does that tell us about human nature? What does it tell us about ourselves? That question still has no definitive answer. And maybe that's for the best. Perhaps the discomfort of not having an answer keeps us alert. But let's return to 1942, to daily life. By mid-1942, Allied bombing of German cities had increased significantly. On May 30th, 1942, the Royal Air Force launched the first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne. More than 1,000 Lancaster and Halifax bombers flew over the city for 90 minutes, dropping more than 1,500 tons of bombs. More than 400 people died, 45,000 were left homeless, and much of the city's historic centre was destroyed. But this was only the beginning. What is it like to live under the bombs? What is it like to know that every night could be the last? Survivors' testimonies describe a macabre routine. The siren sounded, usually at night, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. The family ran to the nearest air raid shelter, the building's basement, a public bunker, a subway station. They took a prepared suitcase with documents, some food, a blanket, a flashlight. Small children were wrapped in blankets and carried half asleep. In the shelter, dozens or hundreds of people crowded into tiny, dark, damp, poorly ventilated spaces. They listened to the distant drone of the engines, the whistle of the falling bombs, the explosions that shook the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. Some prayed. Others cried in silence. Children clung to their mothers. And everyone waited. They waited not to die. When the all-clear signal sounded, sometimes an hour later, sometimes 3, they would emerge to the surface and discover if their house was still standing. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes the building next door was a pile of smouldering rubble and yours was intact. Sometimes it was the other way around. There was no logic, there was no justice, only chance. A woman from Hamburg, Elsa Wendel, described in her diary the experience of coming up from the shelter after a particularly intense bombing in 1943. When we came out, the sky was red. The whole neighbourhood was burning. The heat was so intense we couldn't walk down the street. I saw a woman sitting on the sidewalk with a bundle in her arms. I approached to help her. The bundle was her son. He was dead. Those were the nights of ordinary Germans in 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945. Night after night, week after week, month after month. And Hitler? What did Hitler say while his cities burned? Nothing useful. Hitler systematically refused to visit the bombed cities. Unlike Churchill, who toured the destroyed neighbourhoods of London to lift morale, or the Queen, who visited the wounded in hospitals, Hitler avoided any contact with the suffering of his people. Goebbels begged him to visit the destroyed cities. He refused. "I don't want to see that," he said, according to some testimonies from his inner circle. The man who had promised to protect the German people could not bear to look at what he was doing to them. Instead, Goebbels did visit the bombed cities, and it was precisely that proximity to suffering that gave him material for one of his most effective propaganda coups, the Sportpalast speech of February 18th, 1943. But what happened before that speech to make it necessary? The Battle of Stalingrad is probably the clearest turning point of the entire Second World War, and for the German people, it was a trauma from which they never recovered. The Sixth Army, more than 300,000 men, had entered Stalingrad in September 1942, with the mission of capturing the city that bore Stalin's name. What they found was a hell. The Soviets fought house by house, floor by floor, room by room. The city became a labyrinth of rubble, where German superiority in armour and aviation was useless. Soviet snipers hunted German officers like rabbits. The temperatures dropped. Supplies ran out. On November 19th, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a gigantic pincer movement that encircled the Sixth Army from the flanks, cutting its supply lines and trapping it in a pocket. Hitler forbade retreat. He ordered them to resist to the last man and the last bullet. Goering promised to supply the encircled army by air, an impossible promise to keep, as any logistics officer could have told him. The soldiers trapped in the Stalingrad pocket went from having reduced rations to having hunger, from having hunger to starving, from starving to eating horses, rats, leather from belts, tree bark. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. The wounded froze to death in the trenches because there were no bandages, no morphine, no hope. The last letters that the soldiers of the Sixth Army sent to their families, many of them intercepted and confiscated by Nazi censorship, which never allowed them to reach their destination, are heartbreaking documents. One soldier wrote, "Dear Mother, when you receive this letter, I will already be dead. Don't cry for me. I have lived well. I only regret not being able to hug you one last time." Another wrote, "This war makes no sense. It has all been a lie. I am not dying for Germany. I am dying for the madness of one man." Another, more brief. "Father was right. On February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the more than 300,000 soldiers trapped in the pocket, some 91,000 were taken prisoner, most of them sick, wounded, malnourished, frostbitten. Of those 91,000, only about 6,000 would return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet prisoner of war camps, from disease, hunger, and forced labour. 6,000 out of 300,000, 2 out of every 100. The surrender of Stalingrad was the first major defeat that the regime could not hide from the population. The propaganda had spoken for months of the heroic resistance of the Sixth Army. Now it had to explain its destruction. Goebbels opted for martyrdom. He presented the soldiers of Stalingrad as sacrificial heroes, comparing them to the Spartans at Thermopylae. He declared 3 days of national mourning. He closed the cinemas and theatres. He suspended the music on the radio and replaced it with funeral marches and the slow roll of drums. The psychological impact on the population was devastating. SD reports registered an unprecedented drop in morale. For the first time, a majority of Germans began to seriously doubt the possibility of winning the war. The word Stalingrad became synonymous with catastrophe. And it was then that Goebbels delivered his most famous speech. On February 18th, 1943, before a carefully selected audience of thousands of party officials at the Berlin Sportpalast, Goebbels delivered his total war speech. For more than an hour, with an almost frantic intensity, he argued that the defeat at Stalingrad demonstrated that Germany needed to mobilize all its resources, every man, every woman, every factory, every gram of energy, to win the war. It was a spectacle of masterful manipulation. Goebbels posed 10 rhetorical questions to the audience, each more extreme than the last, and the crowd responded with an affirmative roar to each one. "Do you want total war?" he asked. "Do you want a war, if necessary, more total and more radical than we can even imagine today?" "Yes," roared the crowd. "Are you determined to follow the Führer through thick and thin and to bear even the heaviest burdens to achieve victory?" "Yes." The speech was broadcast by radio throughout Germany, and it worked, at least temporarily. Morale stabilized. The population accepted greater sacrifices. German women, who until then had been relatively protected from labor mobilization, were called en masse to the factories. Workdays were extended. Non-essential consumer goods disappeared. But beneath the surface, something had irrevocably changed. Stalingrad had broken the spell. The Führer was no longer infallible. Victory was no longer certain. And for a growing number of Germans, the question was no longer, when will we win? But how long will this last? And in a lower voice, how will this end for us? And what about those who did not fit the image of the united people that the propaganda sought to project? What about the dissenters, the marginalized, those who could not or would not conform? In 1942 and 1943, a youth phenomenon began to seriously worry the regime, the Edelweiss Piraten, the Edelweiss Pirates. They were informal groups of young people, generally between 14 and 18 years old, who refused to participate in the Hitler Youth and formed their own subcultures. They met in parks, went on countryside excursions, sang forbidden songs, fought with Hitler Youth patrols, and in some cases distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, helped deserters, or sabotaged the war effort. They were not an organized movement with a coherent ideology. They were rebellious teenagers in a system that did not tolerate rebellion. Their names varied by city. In Cologne, they were called Navajos. In Essen, Meandro Pirates. In Dusseldorf, Kittelbach Vultures. They wore informal clothes, shorts, checkered shirts, mountain caps, in deliberate contrast to the uniforms of the Hitler Youth. They sang songs like this: "Hitler's hands are of blood. Hitler's feet are of mud. We are the Edelweiss Pirates, and we do not march at his side." The regime responded with growing brutality. At first, captured youths were shaved and publicly humiliated, then sent to re-education camps, and towards the end of the war, when discipline crumbled and the regime's desperation turned homicidal, some were executed. In November 1944, 13 people, several of them teenagers from Edelweiss pirate groups in Cologne, were publicly hanged without trial. Teenagers hanged for refusing to march. Another youth resistance group was the Swingjugend, the swing youth, middle and upper class youths, who defied the regime by dancing to American jazz and swing, music the Nazis considered degenerate for its African American and Jewish roots. They dressed in Anglo-American fashion, wore long hair, danced in ways that scandalized the authorities, and used ironic greetings like "Swing Heil" instead of "Heil Hitler." It may seem trivial, just music and dance, but in a totalitarian system, Any expression of individuality is an act of resistance. Himmler wrote in a memorandum from January 1942 about the swing youth. The entire leadership must be sent to a concentration camp. There, the youth must first receive a beating and then be subjected to the harshest exercises and the hardest labour. And it was not just a threat. Young people from the swing movement were indeed sent to camps like Moringen and Uckermark. But what really was a concentration camp for the Germans of the time? How much did they know about what happened behind those barbed wires? It is important to distinguish between concentration camps, where prisoners were incarcerated, tortured, and often murdered through slave labour, starvation, and abuse, and extermination camps, whose sole purpose was mass industrial murder in gas chambers. Concentration camps had existed within Germany since 1933. Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen. They were located near towns and cities, whose inhabitants could see the columns of prisoners marching to work, could smell the smoke from the crematoria, could hear the gunshots. The extermination camps, on the other hand, were all in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. They were deliberately built far from the German population, in remote areas. But the separation was not as clean as the regime intended. Auschwitz, for example, was not a single camp, but a complex of more than 40 subcamps that spread over a huge area and employed slave labour in factories, like the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, where German civilians also worked and saw the prisoners daily. The directors of IG Farben knew perfectly well what was happening. They knew and continued producing. And beyond the camps themselves, the exploitation of slave labour was everywhere. By 1944, more than 7 million foreign forced labourers worked in Germany, in factories, farms, mines, construction sites, private homes. They were everywhere. The Germans saw them every day. The Ostarbeiter, workers from the East, mainly from the Soviet Union and Poland, wore distinctive badges, lived in miserable barracks, received starvation rations, and were treated as subhuman beings. Sexual relations between Germans and foreign workers were prohibited under penalty of death, for the foreigner, not for the German, who received a prison sentence. 7 million enslaved people, in the cities, in the towns, in the factories where ordinary Germans worked, and no one says that they didn't know. The year 1943 marked a qualitative change in the war experience for German civilians. The bombings intensified dramatically. The British RAF bombed by night, and the United States Air Force bombed by day. Together, they dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries on German cities. The most devastating case of 1943 was Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg between July the 24th and August 3rd, 1943. In a series of attacks over 10 days and nights, Allied air forces dropped more than 9,000 tons of bombs on the second largest city in Germany. The bombing of July the 27th was particularly catastrophic. The incendiary bombs created a firestorm, a Feuersturm, a meteorological phenomenon caused by the simultaneous fire of thousands of buildings that generates hurricane-force winds that feed the flames and create temperatures of up to 800 degrees Celsius. In the centre of the fire, the streets turned into rivers of molten asphalt. People trying to flee got stuck to the melted ground. The air raid shelters became ovens, where people died asphyxiated or cooked alive. Those who went out into the streets were sucked by the winds of the firestorm towards the centre of the inferno. The bodies shrank to the size of children from the heat. Some evaporated completely. Only their shadows remained burned on the walls. In a single week, more than 37,000 people died in Hamburg. More than 180,000 homes were destroyed. More than 1 million people fled the city in the following weeks. One survivor described, "When we came out of the shelter, the world no longer existed. Everything was fire. The air burned the lungs. I saw people running wrapped in flames. I saw a man crawling without legs. I saw a mother trying to protect her baby with her body. Both were dead. The smell of burnt flesh cannot be described. It cannot be forgotten. Goebbels wrote in his private diary, "Hamburg has caused a shock throughout the people. If the bombings continue like this, we will face extremely serious social problems." Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, confessed after the war that if the Allies had immediately repeated similar attacks on 5 or 6 other industrial cities, Germany would have had to surrender months or even years earlier. But the Allies did not know, and strategic bombing, although it devastated German cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, never managed, on its own, to break the industrial capacity of the Reich or the will to resist of the population. Why not? How is it possible that a population subjected to that level of destruction continued to function? Several reasons. First, human adaptation to horror. People get used to everything, even constant death. The survivors of the bombings developed routines, preparing the emergency suitcase, running to the shelter, coming out, cleaning the rubble, going to work. Life went on. It had to go on. Second, fear of the regime. Even under the bombs, the Gestapo and the SS continued to watch. Defeatism, cowardice, desertion, any sign of weakness was severely punished. Travelling military courts hanged deserters and saboteurs in public squares with signs that said, "I am a coward," or "I betrayed my people." The internal terror was as effective as the external terror. Third, propaganda. Goebbels turned the bombings into a propaganda weapon. Instead of demoralizing, the bombings, according to the official narrative, demonstrated the inhuman brutality of the enemy and justified the resistance. "Do you see what they are doing to us?" was the message. "And you want to surrender to these people?" The propaganda also constantly promised miracle weapons, Wunderwaffen, that would change the course of the war, the V1s, the V2s, jet planes, secret weapons. There was always something coming that would change everything. You just had to hold on a little longer. Fourth, the lack of alternatives. Surrender to whom? How? There was no mechanism for civilians to surrender. There was no organised opposition capable of overthrowing the regime. And the propaganda about what the Allies, especially the Soviets, would do with Germany if they won was terrifying enough for many to prefer to continue fighting rather than face the consequences of defeat. And fifth, perhaps the most uncomfortable, complicity. Many Germans knew they had participated, directly or indirectly, in a criminal system. They knew about the deportations. They knew about forced labour. They knew, at least vaguely, of worse things. And they knew that if Germany lost, there would be a reckoning. The fear of punishment was a powerful incentive to keep fighting. But here we need to stop and ask another question. A question that is rarely asked in documentaries about World War II, but is fundamental to understanding the German experience. What happened with the women? Because the war radically transformed the lives of German women in contradictory, complex, and often devastating ways. The Nazi ideal of woman was clear. Mother, wife, guardian of the home. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was the unofficial motto. Women were expelled from universities and professions in the early years of the regime. They were offered marriage loans on the condition that they stopped working. They were awarded the Cross of Honour of the German Mother, in bronze for 4 children, in silver for 6, in gold for 8 or more. But the war destroyed that ideal. With millions of men at the front, women had to take on roles that the regime had denied them. They worked in munitions factories, drove trams, managed businesses, worked the land. By 1944, women constituted more than half of the German civilian labour force. But unlike British and Soviet women, who received at least some public recognition for their contribution, German women were invisibilised. Propaganda continued to show the heroic soldier, not the exhausted female worker. And then there was the other side, women as victims, the war widows, who by 1945 numbered in the millions, the mothers who lost their sons, the women who raised families alone while trying to survive under the bombs. And at the end of the war, the victims of the massive sexual violence perpetrated by Soviet troops during the invasion of Eastern Germany. A war crime of colossal proportions that we will discuss later. German women bore a disproportionate weight of this war, and yet their experiences have been historically marginalized, subsumed under the male narrative of battles, generals, and political decisions. By January 1944, Germany's military situation was desperate, although propaganda struggled to hide it. In the east, the Red Army advanced inexorably, liberating Ukraine and approaching the borders of the Reich. In Italy, the Allies had landed in September 1943 and were advancing slowly north. In the Atlantic, the Battle of the Submarines was lost. And in the sky, the Luftwaffe was now a shadow of what it had been, incapable of protecting German cities from the bombings that were more devastating each day. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, opening the Second Western Front that Stalin had been demanding for years. The news of the landing was a shock to the German population, although propaganda hastened to downplay it. "The enemy has fallen into the trap," declared the German radio. "Our forces will push him back into the sea." They did not. In a month, the Allies had landed more than 1 million soldiers in France. By August, Paris was liberated. By September, the Allies were at the German border. And inside Germany, life became increasingly difficult, increasingly dangerous, increasingly absurd. Rations were reduced again. Meat practically disappeared from the civilian diet. Potatoes and bread were the basis of the diet, supplemented with turnips, the hated steckrübe that had already been a symbol of hunger during World War I. Women spent hours in queues to get the most basic products. The black market flourished, but the prices were astronomical. A kilo of butter cost what a worker earned in a week. Clothing was a forgotten luxury. Everything was mended, reused, recycled. Curtains became dresses. Fallen parachutes were transformed into underwear, a luxury because the silk was incomparably softer than the synthetic fabrics the regime produced. As a substitute for cotton and wool, which no longer arrived, shoes were resolved with wooden soles that clattered against the ground with a recognizable sound, the sound of scarcity. And the bombings. Always the bombings. By 1944, air raids were no longer limited to the large industrial cities. Small and medium-sized cities were also attacked. The bombing area extended throughout Germany. There was no safe place. The evacuation program, Kinderlandverschicking, literally sending children to the countryside, moved millions of children from the bombed cities to supposedly safer rural areas. Families were separated. Children of 6, 7, 8 years old were sent to live with strangers or in camps organized by the Hitler Youth, far from their parents, for months or years. For many, the trauma of separation was as profound as that of the bombs. A girl from Hamburg, evacuated to Bavaria at the age of 8, recalled decades later, "They left me at the station with a tag on my coat with my name and a number, like a package. My mother was crying but told me to be brave. I didn't see her again for 2 years. When I returned, I didn't recognize her." On July 20th, 1944, the assassination attempt on Hitler that we already mentioned occurred, the Stauffenberg plot. Its failure had terrible consequences not only for the conspirators, but for all of German society. Hitler, convinced that he was surrounded by traitors, unleashed a wave of repression that affected thousands of people, many with no connection whatsoever to the plot. Suspicion became law, paranoia became policy, and something else changed after July 20th. Hitler's relationship with his own army. He had always distrusted the Prussian officer corps, whom he considered elitist and not very committed to Nazism. But now his distrust turned into open hatred. He began to make increasingly irrational military decisions, refusing to authorize retreats, demanding suicidal resistance, relieving or executing generals who contradicted him. The chain of command progressively disintegrated, and the soldiers at the front paid the price. How did the German soldiers live in 1944? What did they feel? What did they think? By then, the morale of the Wehrmacht was at rock bottom, at least among the veterans who had seen too much. The intercepted letters show a dramatic change from 1940 or even 1941. Patriotic enthusiasm had been replaced by exhaustion, cynicism, and fear. The soldiers no longer spoke of victory, but of survival. "I just want to go home" is the refrain that is repeated over and over again. But there was also fanaticism, especially among the youngest, those who had grown up in the Hitler Youth and knew no other world than the Nazi one. For them, defeat was literally inconceivable. They would fight to the end, and many did. A particularly disturbing example is the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, formed almost entirely by 17 and 18-year-old recruits from the Hitler Youth, which fought in Normandy with a ferocity that horrified even Allied veterans. But they also committed atrocities. On June 7th, 1944, soldiers of the Hitlerjugend executed 156 unarmed Canadian prisoners of war at the Ardennes Abbey, teenagers killing prisoners. That was what indoctrination could produce. But how did the regime explain the constant defeats? How did it maintain the hope of a people who saw the enemy approaching from all sides? The answer has a name: Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons. Since 1943, propaganda had promised that Germany was developing revolutionary secret weapons that would change the course of the war. And it was not pure fantasy. Germany did indeed possess advanced technology in some fields. The V-2 rocket, developed by Wernher von Braun in Peenemünde, was the first long-range ballistic weapon in history, a missile that travelled faster than sound and fell on London without prior warning. The Me-262 jet fighter was faster than any Allied fighter. The Type 21 submarine represented a generational leap in submarine warfare. But none of these weapons could change the outcome of the war. They arrived too late, in insufficient quantities, and with technical problems that limited their effectiveness. The V-2 was inaccurate and expensive. Each rocket cost the same as a fighter plane and caused, on average, just 2 deaths per impact. The Me-262 was brilliant in flight, but fragile on the ground and depended on fuel that Germany no longer had. And the Type 21 submarines never entered operational service in significant numbers before the end of the war. But the promise of the Wunderwaffen fulfilled its propaganda function. It kept hope alive, however fragile, that the situation could be reversed. Just a little longer, people said. We just have to hold on a little longer. That hope, fueled by propaganda and sustained by fear of the alternatives, was one of the reasons why Germany continued to fight long after any rational possibility of victory had disappeared. Meanwhile, the machinery of the Holocaust continued to operate at full capacity. In fact, 1944 was the year of the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews, the last large contingent of European Jews that still remained relatively intact. Hungary had been an ally of Germany since 1941, and although its government was anti-Semitic and had approved anti-Jewish laws, it had not handed over its Jews for extermination. That changed on March 19, 1944, when Germany militarily occupied Hungary, its own ally, precisely to ensure control of the Hungarian Jewish population. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the Holocaust for its speed and efficiency. In just 56 days, between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, more than 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported in 147 trains to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The majority were gassed immediately upon arrival, at a rate of up to 12,000 people murdered per day. The crematoria could not keep up. The bodies were also burned in open-air pits, whose smoke and stench spread for kilometres. 437,000 people in less than 2 months. While Germany was losing the war, while its cities were burning, while its soldiers were dying by the thousands every day, the regime dedicated trains, fuel, personnel, and scarce resources that could have been used for the war effort to the murder of innocent civilians. That says something profound about the nature of Nazism. The Holocaust was not a side effect of the war. It was not an excess committed in the chaos of the conflict. It was the central objective of the regime. The war was, in a sense, the means. The extermination was the end. And the ordinary Germans, did they know about the Hungarian deportations? Probably not in detail. But by 1944, the diffuse knowledge that something terrible was happening to the Jews deported to the East was already practically universal. The allusions in private conversations, the letters from the front, the rumours, the indirect clues, all pointed in the same direction. Knowing it with absolute certainty was not the same as strongly suspecting it. But the line between the two is very thin. The historian Peter Longerich, in his exhaustive study, Daven haben wir nichts, gewusst, we knew nothing about that, concludes that by 1943 to 1944, the vast majority of Germans knew that Jews were being murdered on a large scale in the East, although the exact details, the gas chambers, the specific methods, were not widely known. Ignorance was, to a large extent, a choice. But what happens when the end is near? What happens inside a society? When defeat is already inevitable, but the system refuses to recognize it? What happens when a regime decides that if it cannot win, it will take its own people to the grave? Because that is exactly what happened in the last months of Nazi Germany. And what we are going to tell now is perhaps the most terrifying part of this entire story. Not because it involves foreign enemies, but because it shows what a government can do to its own people when power becomes suicidal. The year 1945 began with Germany surrounded. The Soviets were in Poland and East Prussia. The Western Allies were in Belgium, Holland, and the West Bank of the Rhine. The bombings were now almost continuous, day and night, without pause, without respite. The cities that were still standing were attacked again and again, until they were reduced to rubble. On February 13th and 14th, 1945, the city of Dresden was bombed in a series of attacks that have generated historical debate to this day. Dresden was known as the Florence of the Elbe, a city of extraordinary Baroque architectural beauty, famous for its opera, its museums, and its churches. It was also, in February 1945, a city full of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. Estimates of the death toll have varied enormously over the years, from the figures inflated by Nazi propaganda, 200,000 or more, to the more rigorous estimates of the Commission of Historians that investigated the issue in 2010, which concluded that the number of victims was approximately 25,000. 25,000 people in a city that no longer had relevant military significance. Was it a war crime? Many historians consider it, at least, a disproportionate use of force against a civilian target. Others argue that Dresden was an important railway hub for the transport of troops to the Eastern Front and that its destruction had strategic value. The debate continues. But for the inhabitants of Dresden, the debate was irrelevant. What they lived through was the apocalypse. A survivor, Victor Klemperer, a Jewish philologist who had survived until that moment thanks to his marriage to an Aryan woman, described the night of the bombing in his diary. The sky was blood red. The houses were collapsing like houses of cards. People were running in all directions, tripping over the dead. I saw a burning horse, running crazed through the street. I saw a man holding his own severed arm, looking at it with incomprehension. And while Dresden burned, something was happening in the east of Germany that would terrify the population more than any bomb. The Red Army was entering German territory. The first Soviet soldiers crossed the border of East Prussia in October 1944. What they found, or what propaganda had told them they would find, was the territory of the enemy who had invaded their homeland, killed 27 million of their compatriots, destroyed their cities and towns, and committed unspeakable atrocities against Soviet civilians for 3.5 years of occupation. The thirst for revenge was understandable, humanly understandable, though not justifiable in its consequences. What followed was a wave of violence against the German civilian population, mainly against women, of proportions difficult to comprehend. Estimates of the number of German women raped by Soviet soldiers during the invasion vary enormously, from the 100,000 that the most conservative estimates acknowledge to the 2 million that some historians suggest. The most cited figure in modern historiography is around 1.4 million cases of rape, many of them repeated and gang rapes. In Berlin alone, it is estimated that between 100,000 and 130,000 women were raped during and after the conquest of the city in April and May of 1945. The victims were of all ages, from 8-year-old girls to 80-year-old women. Many were raped repeatedly for days or weeks. Many died from the assaults themselves, from sexually transmitted diseases, by suicide. This was one of the greatest war crimes of the entire Second World War, and for decades it was a taboo subject, both in the divided post-war Germany, where talking about German suffering was considered a way of relativizing Nazi crimes, and in the Soviet Union, where acknowledging the atrocities committed by the glorious Red Army was unacceptable. The truth is that the war turned millions of German women into victims of a regime that used them, exposed them, and finally abandoned them, and victims of an invading army that treated them as spoils of war. And both things can be true simultaneously without one justifying the other. But what was the Nazi regime doing while its own people were being massacred, raped, and bombed? It was entrenching itself in madness. Hitler, locked in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, issued orders to armies that no longer existed, moved phantom divisions on maps that no longer corresponded to reality, and refused to consider any form of surrender, negotiation, or even evacuation of civilians. On March 19, 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, the decree on measures of destruction in the territory of the Reich, which ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure, bridges, factories, power plants, water systems, food depots, railway lines, so that it would not fall into enemy hands. In other words, Hitler was ordering the destruction of everything the German people needed to survive. If the war is lost, Hitler told Albert Speer, according to the latter's testimony, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. It is not necessary to consider the basis that the people will need to continue a primitive existence. On the contrary, it is better to destroy these things ourselves, because this nation will have proven to be the weaker one, and the future will belong exclusively to the nation of the East, which is the stronger one. Read that again. Hitler was saying that the German people deserved to be destroyed for having failed to win the war. The man who claimed to love Germany above all things was ordering its annihilation. Albert Speer, who was not exactly a hero of the resistance but a convicted war criminal, who exploited millions of slave labourers, refused to comply with the Nero Decree. According to his own testimony, which must be taken with scepticism, given his incentives to portray himself favourably in the post-war period, he sabotaged the order by travelling around Germany and convincing local officials not to destroy the infrastructure. How much of this is true and how much is self-justification? Historians debate. But what is certain is that the Nero Decree was not fully executed, partly due to the resistance of local officials, partly because the chaos was already such that orders from Berlin often did not even reach their destination. In those last weeks, Nazi Germany turned into a disintegrating state, where the violence, which had previously been directed outwards, against the Jews, the Slavs, the enemies, turned inwards with a demented ferocity. The travelling military courts, the Fliegende Standgerichte, roamed the country hanging deserters, stragglers, and any man of military age not in uniform. They hung them from trees, from lampposts, from balconies, with signs that said, "I am a coward," or "I am a traitor to the people." In the last weeks of the war, more German soldiers were executed by their own side than in the entire First World War. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia, was created in October 1944 as a last military resort, recruiting all men between 16 and 60 who were not already in the armed forces. Old men, teenagers, men with disabilities, all were thrown to the front with obsolete weapons, minimal training, and no hope. In Berlin, during the final battle, there were 12 and 13-year-old children in oversized uniforms, firing Panzerfausts at Soviet tanks. Do you understand? Children firing at tanks because a sick old man in a bunker refused to surrender. And despite everything, some continued to believe. Even in April 1945, with the Soviets kilometers from the Chancellery, there were Germans who hoped for a miracle, who hoped for the Wunderwaffen, who hoped that the Western Allies would fight the Soviets and save Germany, who hoped for something. The propaganda had done its job too well. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery. He was 56 years old, minutes before his new wife Eva Braun, whom he had married just the day before, on April 29th, in a brief and surreal civil ceremony in the depths of the bunker, ingested a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were taken to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and burned while Soviet bombs fell meters away. A handful of loyalists raised their arms in a final Nazi salute as the flames consumed the remains of the man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. And with Hitler's death, the suffering did not end. It didn't even come close. Because what came next, the hours, the days, the weeks following April 30th, 1945, was a chaos of violence, desperation, and death that many survivors would describe as worse than the war itself. In the bunker, after Hitler's suicide, Joseph Goebbels, who had been named Chancellor in Hitler's will, made a decision that still chills the blood. On May 1st, 1945, Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children with cyanide: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, all with names beginning with H in honour of Hitler, and then committed suicide themselves in the Chancellery garden. The children were between 4 and 12 years old. 6 children, murdered by their own parents, because their parents could not conceive of a world without Nazism. Is there anything more monstrous than that? Is there anything that better illustrates the absolute madness into which the regime had fallen? But Goebbels was not the only one. Throughout the Reich, a wave of suicides unprecedented in modern history occurred. In Berlin, in April and May of 1945, nearly 4,000 suicides were recorded, more than in the entire previous year. In small towns, entire families took their own lives upon learning of the Soviet advance. In Demmin, a town in Pomerania, between 700 and 1,000 people committed mass suicide between April 30th and May 3rd, 1945. They drowned in rivers, poisoned themselves, hanged themselves, cut their veins. Mothers killed their children before killing themselves. It was the end of the world, literally. Why? What pushed thousands of people to prefer death over surrender? Several things. The fear of the Soviets, a fear fueled by Nazi propaganda for years, but also based on real facts. The atrocities committed by the Red Army in East Prussia were known and terrifying. The shame. Many Nazi officials knew they would be tried and punished. The indoctrination. For those who had internalized Nazi ideology, defeat was not just a political catastrophe but an existential one, the end of everything that gave meaning to their lives. And the sheer terror of living in a country that was falling apart in real time, without law, without order, without hope. But for the vast majority of Germans, Surrender did not mean suicide, but survival. Survival in conditions that few people can even visualize today. On May 7th, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of Germany at the Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The ceremony was repeated on May 8th in Berlin, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. The war was over. But what did over mean for an ordinary German in May 1945? It meant this: his country was in ruins, literally. The main German cities had been destroyed between 50 and 80%. Berlin was a lunar landscape of rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Munich, Frankfurt, mountains of debris where there had once been streets, squares, churches, hospitals, schools. The Allies estimated that just to remove the rubble from the German cities would require 16 years of continuous work. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, became the symbol of the post-war period. Millions of women, many of them widows or with husbands who were prisoners of war or missing, worked with their bare hands or with improvised tools to clear the streets, salvage reusable bricks, clean up the chaos. They passed human chains of brick by brick, from sunup to sundown, day after day. The infrastructure was destroyed. There was no electricity in many areas. There was no running water. There was no public transport. There was no government. There was no police. There was no law. The Allies, Americans, British, French, and Soviets, divided the country into 4 zones of occupation. But in the first weeks, authority was fragmented and chaos reigned. Hunger became the defining experience of the post-war period. Official rations fell to starvation levels, between 800 and 1,500 daily calories, depending on the zone. In the Soviet zone, conditions were particularly harsh. But even in the Western zones, people went hungry. Children searched for food in the garbage of the Allied barracks. Women exchanged anything: clothes, jewellery, furniture, their own bodies, for food. American cigarettes became the de facto currency. A pack of Lucky Strike was worth more than a worker's monthly salary. And the soldiers, of the more than 10 million men who had served in the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS, and other military formations, millions were in prisoner of war camps. In the West, the Allied camps, though harsh, offered at least a reasonable hope of release. In the East, the Soviet camps were deferred death sentences. Of the 3 million German soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviets, more than 1 million died in captivity. The last German prisoners did not return from the Soviet Union until 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. 10 years. There are men who went to war in 1941 and did not see their families again until 1955. Their children did not recognize them. Their wives had rebuilt their lives. They themselves were shadows of what they had been: sick, traumatized, broken. And what happened to the millions of Germans who lived in the Eastern Territories, East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, that were ceded to Poland and the Soviet Union? They were expelled. Between 1945 and 1950, between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were forced to abandon the Eastern Territories, the lands where their families had lived for centuries in many cases. It was the largest forced migration in the history of Europe. The conditions of the expulsion varied. Some were relatively orderly, under Allied supervision. But many, especially those that occurred during the chaos of 1945 and early 1946, were brutal. The estimates of deaths during the expulsions vary between 500,000 and 2 million people, depending on the sources. Millions of people dispossessed of everything: houses, lands, belongings, memories, and thrown into a destroyed country that could no longer feed its own population. The refugees arrived en masse in the Western occupation zones, crammed into cattle trains, on foot, with what they could carry in their hands. They were received with hostility by the local inhabitants, who already had enough with their own problems. But what happened with the truth? When did the Germans learn, in an unequivocal, undeniable, documented way, what their government had done in their name? The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, exposed to the world and to the Germans themselves the magnitude of the crimes of the Nazi regime. But perhaps more shocking than the trials were the images. The Allies forced German civilians from the localities near the concentration camps to visit them and see with their own eyes what had happened. In Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Ohrdruf, the local inhabitants were forced to walk among the piled corpses, the crematoria ovens, the barracks full of living skeletons. Some cried, some vomited, some fainted. Many said, "We didn't know." Was it true? For some, probably yes. For many others, it was a convenient lie that they would repeat for decades. General Eisenhower, who visited the Ohrdruf camp on April 12, 1945, wrote, "I saw everything that could be shown to me. I did it deliberately to be in a position to give first-hand testimony about these things, in case any tendency ever arose in the future to qualify these accusations simply as propaganda." He knew the deniers would come, and he was right. Now, what did the Germans do with this truth? How did an entire nation process the revelation that its government had perpetrated the greatest crime in history? The answer, during the first decades of the post-war period, was to a large extent not processing it. The phenomenon that historians call the Great Silence, Die große Stille, characterized German culture in the 50s and 60s. Most Germans simply did not talk about the war. They did not talk about Nazism. They did not talk about the Holocaust. They did not talk about what they had done, seen, or known. There was a tacit consensus. Look forward, not back. Rebuild. Work. Forget. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of West Germany in the 50s, provided the perfect excuse. There was work to be done. There was a country to rebuild. There was no time for the past. And the legal system facilitated it. Although the main war criminals were tried in Nuremberg, the vast majority of mid and low-level perpetrators never faced justice. Nazi officials were reintegrated into society. Judges who had applied racial laws returned to the courts. Policemen who had participated in deportations returned to the police stations. Professors who had taught racial ideology returned to the classrooms. Doctors who had participated in deadly experiments returned to practice. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the father of post-war West Germany, appointed as his chief of staff Hans Globke, a man who had co-authored the legal commentaries on the Nuremberg laws. Denazification, the Allied process to purge Nazis from public life, was broad in scale but superficial in depth. Millions of Germans filled out questionnaires, the Fragebogen, which classified them into 5 categories, from major offenders to exonerated. The vast majority classified themselves in the most benign categories. Friends and neighbours wrote each other certificates of good conduct, the so-called Persil-Schein, in reference to Persil detergent, because they whitewashed the recipient's Nazi past. It was a massive exercise of collective self-absolution. When did this change? When did Germany begin to face its past head-on? Slowly, and not without resistance. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, broadcast on television to the whole world, put the Holocaust back at the centre of the conversation. Public. The Frankfurt trials of 1963 to 1965, where Auschwitz guards and officials were tried, showed the Germans that the perpetrators were not distant monsters, but normal men who lived among them. The student movement of 1968, whose protagonists were the children of the Nazi generation, aggressively broke the silence, confronting their parents with the question, "What did you do during the war?" And little by little, over decades, with pain, with resistance, with setbacks, Germany developed what is known today as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, a long and unpronounceable term that literally means overcoming the past. A process of recognition, memory, and responsibility that, although imperfect and always evolving, is unique in world history. No other country has faced its criminal past with the depth and persistence that Germany has shown. The monuments, like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, inaugurated in 2005, a field of 2,711 concrete stela in the heart of the capital, are the visible expression of this process. But the real work happens in the classrooms, in the museums, in the families, in the difficult conversations that each generation of Germans must have with the previous ones. Is it enough? It will never be, because no amount of monuments or apologies can erase 6 million murders. But the effort, the honest, sustained and painful effort to remember, is at least something. But now let's go back, because there is something we have not yet told, something that occurred in the last days of the war and that shows the most sinister face of the regime in its agony. The death marches. What were the death marches? And why are they perhaps the least known episode of the Holocaust? As the Allied armies advanced from the west and the Red Army from the east, the Nazis faced a dilemma with the hundreds of thousands of prisoners who remained in the concentration camps. They did not want them to be liberated because they were witnesses to the crimes, and they did not have time or resources to kill them all at once, so they opted for the cruelest solution. They took them out of the camps and forced them to walk. Between January and May 1945, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, Jews, political prisoners, prisoners of war, gypsies, homosexuals, were forced to march on foot for days or weeks, often in the middle of winter, without food, without water, without adequate clothing. Those who could not keep up were shot on the side of the road. Those who stopped to rest were executed. Those who fell were executed. Those who tried to escape were executed. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 350,000 prisoners died on the death marches, murdered, dead of exhaustion, cold, hunger, disease. Many died in the last days, in the last hours before liberation. And these marches did not occur in remote areas of occupied Poland. They occurred on German territory, through towns and cities, under the eyes of the civilian population. Survivors' testimonies describe how the inhabitants of the towns saw them pass, columns of walking skeletons, covered in rags, staggering through the streets, and looked away. Some threw stones, others closed the windows, a few, very few, left bread or water on the side of the road. A survivor of the march from Sachsenhausen recalled, "We passed through a beautiful village. The houses had flowers in the windows. A woman was hanging clothes in the garden. She looked at us as if we were ghosts. Perhaps we were. Those ghosts were human beings. And that woman, hanging her clothes while death passed before her eyes, is perhaps the image that best summarizes what it meant to live in Nazi Germany. Not the image of the monster, but the image of indifference. But can a whole nation be judged? Can 70 million people be condemned for the crimes of a regime? This is the most difficult question of this entire story. And the answer we give determines not only how we understand the past, but also how we face the present. Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher, addressed this issue in his book, The Question of German Guilt, published in 1946, just 1 year after the end of the war. Jaspers distinguished 4 types of guilt. Criminal guilt, of those who committed specific crimes, the murderers, the torturers, the planners of the genocide. This guilt corresponds to them individually and must be judged by courts. Political guilt, of all citizens of a state that commits crimes in its name. This guilt is not criminal. An ordinary citizen is not responsible for Auschwitz in the same way as Eichmann, but it is real. All Germans, by the fact of having lived under the Nazi regime without overthrowing it, share a collective responsibility for what that regime did. Moral guilt, of those who, knowing or suspecting what was happening, did nothing. They did not denounce, they did not protest, they did not resist, they looked the other way. This guilt is personal and non-transferable. and metaphysical guilt, the guilt that, according to Jaspers, all human beings share for every injustice that occurs in the world when we do not do everything possible to prevent it. If I do not risk my life to prevent the murder of another, wrote Jaspers, I feel guilty in a way that is not adequately explainable by law or politics. These categories do not resolve the question, but they illuminate it, because they allow us to see that responsibility is not binary, guilty or innocent, but a spectrum, and that in that spectrum, every German who lived under Nazism occupies a different place. Now, there is one more story I need to tell, a story that I have left for this moment, because I believe it summarizes, better than any statistic or analysis, what it meant to live in Nazi Germany. It is the story of a family, a real family, a family like thousands. The Scholls, not Hans and Sophie, the heroes of the White Rose, but their father, Robert Scholl. Robert Scholl was an ordinary man, a mayor of a small town, a moderate liberal who was never a Nazi, but who was also not a hero of the resistance. When his children were arrested and executed for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets, Robert Scholl could do nothing. He did not go to the trial. He did not go to the execution. He found out later. But before his children were executed, Robert Scholl had been arrested himself in 1942 for making a critical comment about Hitler in a private conversation that was denounced by a co-worker. He spent months in prison before being released. A father who went to prison for speaking. 2 children who were executed for writing. A family destroyed for telling the truth. And the millions of families who said nothing. Those who were silent, who obeyed, who survived. Those who were never heroes, but were not monsters either. Those families are the most difficult to judge, and perhaps the most important to understand, because they are the most similar to us. And what can we learn today from all this? What does the experience of living in Nazi Germany tell us about our own era? I'm not going to fall into easy comparisons. Nazi Germany was a specific historical phenomenon, unrepeatable in its exact details, but the mechanisms that allowed a civilized society to fall into barbarism, propaganda, fear, indifference, the dehumanization of the other, blind obedience to authority, the willingness to sacrifice truth for comfort. Those mechanisms are not exclusive to any era or any people. Primo Levi, the Italian writer and Auschwitz survivor, wrote, "It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." And he was right. But is there more to tell? Are there aspects of life in Nazi Germany that we have not yet explored? Yes, many. Because the experience of 70 million people during 12 years of dictatorship and 6 years of war is inexhaustible. Every individual has a story. Every family has a secret. Every city has its scars. There are stories we have not told. The story of homosexuals persecuted under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, imprisoned in concentration camps, marked with pink triangles, subjected to chemical castration, and then, after the war ended, imprisoned again by the Allies because the law that criminalized them remained in force in West Germany until 1969. Victims twice over, forgotten for decades. The story of the Gypsies, the Sinti and the Roma, who were exterminated in a genocide parallel to the Jewish Holocaust that remains dramatically unknown. It is estimated that between 220,000 and 500,000 Gypsies were murdered by the Nazis, a proportion of their population equivalent or even superior to that of the Jews. They call it the Poramos, the devouring, and for decades it was ignored even by the historiography of the Holocaust. The story of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused to swear allegiance to the regime, to give the Nazi salute, and to serve in the army, and for that were sent to concentration camps where they wore purple triangles. They were offered freedom if they renounced their faith. The vast majority refused. The story of the Soviet prisoners of war, more than 5 million of whom were captured by Germany, and of whom more than 3 million died in captivity from deliberate starvation, disease, slave labour, and direct murder. It was a war crime of colossal proportions that remains surprisingly little known outside of Russia. The story of the Mischlings, Germans of partially Jewish descent, classified into absurd categories according to the number of Jewish grandparents they had, who lived in a legal and existential limbo for 12 years, too Jewish to be accepted by the regime, too German to feel solidarity with the persecuted. Each of these stories deserves its own video. Each one deserves hours of research and narration. And maybe one day we will tell them. But for now, let's go back to where we started. To the morning of September 1st, 1939. To that mother, Ilse, who woke up her children to take them to the shelter. What became of her? We don't know. Because Ilse Meyer is not a name that appears in the history books. There are thousands of women who could have been her. Women who lived the war from the inside, who lost husbands, sons, brothers, fathers, who suffered hunger, cold, fear, who survived the bombs, the rubble, the occupation, who rebuilt a country with their hands, and who, in the end, never told their story, because no one asked them. This story has been about them, about the soldiers who did not want to fight, about the children who were indoctrinated before they could think, about those who resisted and paid with their lives, about those who did not resist and paid with their consciences, about an entire nation trapped in the most sophisticated machinery of destruction that humanity has ever built. It has not been an easy story to tell, and it probably has not been easy to hear. But it was necessary, because understanding how people lived inside Nazi Germany is not an exercise in morbid curiosity. It is an act of prevention. Every person who knows this story, in all its complexity, in all its darkness, in all its pain, is a person less susceptible to being deceived by the demagogues of the future. Because the demagogues are still there, and the techniques the Nazis used, propaganda, fear, hatred of the different, the promise of greatness in exchange for obedience, have not disappeared. They have evolved. They have been digitized, but their essence is the same. And the only defense against them is memory. But did it really end there? Did the story of Nazi Germany end with the surrender? No, because the consequences of what happened between 1933 and 1945 are still reverberating today, in German politics, in international relations, in the collective psychology of a people, in the debates on immigration, national identity, and the limits of freedom of expression. And there is more, something that is rarely discussed but is fundamental. What happened to the perpetrators? Not with the big names, Göring, Hess, Speer, those who were tried in Nuremberg, but with the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of mid and low-level perpetrators who made the Holocaust possible, the officials who processed the deportations, the train drivers who drove the trains, the guards who watched over the camps, the policemen who carried out the raids, the doctors who selected who lived and who died on the ramps of Auschwitz. The majority were never tried. The majority returned to civilian life, had families, grew old, died in peace. Some emigrated to South America, the Middle East, even to the United States, where intelligence agencies like the CIA recruited them for their anti-communist experience, a shameful chapter of the Cold War that only came fully to light decades later. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust, lived quietly in Argentina under the name Ricardo Klement until Mossad agents kidnapped him in May 1960 and took him to Jerusalem to be tried. He was hanged on May 31st, 1962. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, who performed monstrous medical experiments on prisoners, including twin children, fled to South America and lived with impunity in Brazil until he drowned on a beach in 1979. He was never captured. He was never tried. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was protected by US intelligence services after the war and lived in Bolivia for decades, before being extradited to France in 1983. And these are just the famous names. There were thousands more, tens of thousands more, men who participated in mass murders and who later returned home, opened businesses, raised children and grandchildren, and never answered for their actions. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, named in honor of the Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to pursuing Nazi criminals, is still active today, although the last perpetrators are now over 90 years old. In recent years, trials have been held against centenarian concentration camp guards, not because these trials will change history, but because justice, however late, has a symbolic value that transcends practical utility. And now, what is left for us after walking through this story? After walking through the bombed streets, the crowded shelters, the extermination camps, the bunkers of desperation, we are left with the responsibility to remember and the obligation to ask, not how could they do that, as if it was something alien to us, something that only happens to other peoples in other eras, but how can we prevent it from happening again? A question that involves us directly, each one of us, here and now. Because the history of Nazi Germany is not the history of an evil people. It is the story of what can happen when fear becomes politics, when hatred becomes identity, when obedience becomes virtue, and when truth becomes a luxury that few can afford. And with that, we have reached the end of this journey. A journey through the darkest years of modern history, told not from the offices of generals or the tables of diplomats, but from the kitchens, the trenches, the basements, the factories, the schools, and the air raid shelters where millions of people lived and too many died, the Second World War from within. But is the story really complete? Is there anything I have missed? Any fact that has surprised you? Any question that has been left unanswered for you? Tell us in the comments, because this is not a monologue, it is a conversation. And the best conversations do not end when someone stops talking, but when someone starts to think. If this video made you reflect, share it. If you think it is important that more people know this story, give it a like. And if you want to continue exploring the darkest and also the most luminous chapters of human history, subscribe. Remember, our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers, and each subscription brings us one step closer. This was all. Until the next video.